Hey everybody, so let me go ahead and share my screen. We're going to get into our final sets of lectures, which is crazy. It seems like this semester has flown by. But we're going to talk about, in this lecture, we're going to talk about state law and social policy. And then we're also going to talk about the chapter on activism, change, and feminist futures. We're going to kind of end with that because while the entire semester can feel very heavy, it can feel very much like we're preaching consistently about all the things that are wrong with society, because we are. But also it needs to feel like there's hope for change, because that's the whole point of why we bring these critiques out into the world. Is the whole point of why most feminist scholars do what they do. We are here to evoke, elicit, and try to help people to find their own voice, and to do so in a way that hopefully produces a feeling like you can change your world, and that there is change happening in the world. And so that's what we're going to end on. So we're going to start with a little bit more bad stuff, because we're going to start a little bit with how the state impacts women and just how the state in general evokes or elicits inequality. And then we'll get into the more promising, fun stuff. So we're going to start with government and representation. And I put a lot of links in here in order to kind of help you get to other things in case you're interested in this. Let me move this little guy over here so that you can see those maps a little better. But we're going to talk about a few things here, and then I do have some slides in here that we're going to skip over quickly, but that are in there for your information. And essentially those are going to be the first in Women in Law and Politics, and really just talk about essentially the big first and big moments that have happened throughout American history for women. We're going to talk quickly, real quick. The definition of the state is really, and we're not talking about like a state as in like the 50 states in the United States. We're talking about state as in a governing law-abiding area. And so it's a form of social organization representing official power in society. It's the government, law, and social power, the courts, the criminal justice system, the military, and the police. And so essentially a state, at any time you hear the word nation state, it's essentially talking about a entity that is in and of itself has its own cultural element along with some kind of state, which is essentially some kind of governing body operating within it. And so that's why when you hear the UN talking, or if you hear anything in the news about nation states are just organized groups of people with similar like-minded culture, geographic region, and or a particular governing body. So a government is a political system. Democracy is the political system in which we adhere to here in the United States. However, democracy is based on equal representation. And let's be honest, that is not how the US government works. We do not equally represent the population for which the United States is. If so, we would have at least 50%, probably a little more than that, of women that are helping to create laws to govern the country as a whole. And we would also have a lot more people of color within these governing bodies, as well as ideas, okay? Because not only are we ideologically not equally representative per the population that holds specific ideologies, we are also not identity-based equally represented. But who is not equally represented? And again, we talk about this in the way of mostly it's any kind of marginalized status, because I guarantee you, well, I know this for a fact, white male of the age of 50 plus are way over representative to the population in the actual country. And how this happens is essentially there are no term limits. There are gerrymandering of districting and redistricting in order to disconnect communities of color from being able to cast votes that can increase their representation within the government. It also allows for a large amount of power to rule areas in specific kinds of red states. It also allows for there to be a populist vote that doesn't match the electoral vote. And we can get into that more and more if you want to have a conversation with me about the ways in which our government's election cycles do not represent its population. We could talk about this for days, but I'm not going to. We also need to talk about, again, who gets the right to vote and why it matters. So the U.S. Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico are technically part of the United States. However, they do not get electoral votes, and they do not get to vote unless they have a U.S.-based residence that they can keep in order to keep their voter registration. So just a reminder, as well as specific citizens can get their voting rights taken away. So if you're talking about anyone that has committed a felony, anyone that has a certain amount of misdemeanors, so they take away their ability to essentially be a citizen, yet they still have to pay taxes and do all of that thing, all of those things. So it's representation has been hampered in a number of ways in this country. And historically, when you look at who was determined a citizen, it was white landowning individuals. And so it did not include the people for which its land was taking. So there was no indigenous vote. There still is a rather limited ways in which indigenous persons can be part of the government because they are technically a foreign entity of themselves. That's a whole nother ballgame. You have anyone who has immigrated into this country has a specific series of steps before they can start voting. Anyone who does not have any kind of proof of identity in a particular way, which in some cases that just boils down to being able to access certain buildings, being able to access voter registrations, things of that nature. And then historically, we did not allow women to vote until 1920, and that's white women. Again, landowning women. We did not allow people of color, specifically Black people, to vote until after the civil rights movement. And so that was in the 60s. So we have had a history, and that's not that long ago. So again, I think remembering the context for which voter suppression has and continues in this country is extensively important as we look to our history. Sorry. We also have the ways in which courts determine citizenship, and again, that falls back down to immigration status, and that falls back down to the context for which we decide essentially what is constitutional and what is not. Women in the government. So our founding fathers viewed women as non-political and a non-citizen because they were considered property of men at that point in juncture. And so they essentially were served in the government via the political action of the husband and or brother and or what have you, the male patriarchs in the family. In 1848 in Seneca Falls, you had, so this was a period of time in which women were starting to write about, starting to think about, starting to really concentrate their energy on what and why they weren't allowed particular means in society. The 19th Amendment, which was allowed, again, white women, very key point here, to vote, is what happened in 1920. We just had our 100 years of that 2 years ago, and there was big celebrations about that. Again, a reminder, though, is that we're celebrating the centennial of white women being able to vote, not all women, and to understand the roles in which Ida B. Wells and specific Black feminists of that time period really played into the ability for the right to vote is something that we historically don't cover, and something that even in our textbook is likely given very little visibility. So, but it is something to look into, because without Ida B. Wells and without Black feminists of that era, we would not have the 19th Amendment. Susan B. Anthony and the test of the 16th Amendment. Okay, so we're going to get into that in one of the, I'm going to save that because we're going to get into that in one of the side readings for this module in this chapter. And so I'm going to talk more about that in a little bit. Again, white women could not pass citizenship rights to their children until the 1930s, could not be a part of a jury until the 1970s. And even now, gender nor race can be justification for bias in jury selection. So even if you are a Black man on trial and your entire panel is white women, which would not understand your lived space and entity, that is not enough context to say that this is not a jury of my peers. This is not a jury of someone who would understand my lived experiences. That does not justify, is not justification for bias or in jury selection or jury competence. Women hold far fewer spots in national, local, and state political positions. We're going to talk about that in just a second. And then we're going to talk about the Equal Rights Amendment for just a bit. The ERA. It was first proposed in 1923, and essentially this was just legislation that said that on paper, no matter what, women legally have the equal amount of opportunity, blah, 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 lack of discrimination, pursuit of happiness, the whole nine, for as men do. So it was literally put in writing, the genders are equal. That passed in Congress finally in 1972, but it was not ratified into an actual amendment into the Constitution, because it was there were three states short in 1982. And so if you look up here at this is the original grouping, and it had the red states in it too. That was the original ones. You need 38 states to ratify an amendment to the Constitution after the state passes, or after Congress passes it. And so since then, 4 states have taken away their ratification, and 3 have actually gone ahead and ratified after the deadline. The problem here is that we still need that 38. Because of that, it allowed time to elapse and essentially for the bill to get pushed aside or not to happen. So it has been put forth in every Congress since. 19 states, which is this bottom picture, have passed an ERA clause in their own state constitution, but federally it is still not recognized. Conservative political organizations have misrepresented it to say that essentially women would have to do these things. They would have to serve in the military, that this would cause families to get messed up. It would cause women to have to work, these kinds of misnomers, because again, they pit it as not necessarily a choice, but something that dispels political ailments so that they can be against gender equality without being against gender equality. Still, it has overwhelming public support, and yet it is still not around. To know more about this and to keep up to date, there's a website down here at the bottom that will help you with that. For more on the demographics of Congress, please seek out this Pew. This will give you all your demographics and an updated status on women in parliament ranking, which is something that they were talked about in the book. The U.S. is now at 78. All right, we're going to put me back over here. Government and representation, the gender gap. So we're going to talk about voting behavior and party identification, which is just that women more often align with the Democratic Party. Major interests for women include the topics of education, welfare, healthcare, and environment. Major interests for men tend to lean towards defense, anti-welfare, and anti-affirmative action policies. Again, these are mostly white men in specific agendas. The difference here is, again, this is not inclusive. This is not homogenous, right? We have all of us have our different pivot points. However, statistically, this is how the breakdown happens. Age also plays a big factor. 2/3 of the voters from the ages of 18 to 29 voted Democratically. Attitudes toward public policy favor an activist role, and women tend to favor an activist role in government, are more supportive of healthcare and basic services, are more supportive of restrictions to firearm ownership, are more supportive to marriage equality, and are more likely to favor legal abortions with or without restrictions. And so a term that they talked about in here was this idea of the femme converter, or the covered woman, which again is this idea that women were property of the husband, that they didn't need to be covered explicitly because they were essentially part of the political ailment of the men in their realm. And so women had no property rights. And again, we're going to talk about white women here specifically, and then women more broadly for the first one, and then women more broadly as we talk about the rest of them. But women have no property rights, or no ability to have property or to inherit in property, when widowed or what have you, until 1848, which again is almost 100 years past when the U.S. was formed. No rape or domestic violence could be filed for charges within a marriage until the 1980s to really the early 1990s. No banking or seeking employment without a husband's written consent or disclosure forms until the 1980s. It didn't. Now, listen, that started in some states before then, but it wasn't federally recognized until the 1980s. No being able to make your own medical decisions until the 1960s or 70s, or make your kids' medical decisions until really the 1970s. And this again is on a federal level. No divorce until 1970s, or child custody and separations until the 1970s. And again, these are things that are in really recent past. And it's also things that, when you look at the breakdown of what states had legislation for this and what didn't, and where the places are that took the longest to do this, you're also going to correspond with reproductive justice movements, right? You're going to correspond where you can have safe abortions in places that these things happened earlier, and it's going to coincide with generally blue states, and your red states are going to have higher anti-abortion rhetoric, and they're going to be have a lot of these things take a lot longer in their state history. So there's that. These next few slides, again, I'm just going to go through real quick. Kentucky representation, just again, as we talk about the lack of women in leadership roles. Kentucky's population as of the census data is 61% white, 12.4% blacks, 18.7% Hispanic, 6% Asian alone. American Indian and Alaska is 1.1. Very little Native Hawaiian or other Pacific island, which makes sense. We're kind of landlocked, and it would take something very interesting to get somebody there. Usually college students. Other race alone is 8.4, and any kind of biracial individual or multiple race individual is going to be about 10% of the population. Via sex, again, this is not gender, but sex, you're going to see 58.7% female. But when you look at the House and Senate, that does not look like that, right? So you have women is only 30% versus the almost, over double that in men. White, you're going to see 92, and only 6 persons of color, and only 3 of them are women of color, right? That's a huge disproportion to the amount that's up here. When you look at Kentucky State Senate, you're going to see 6 women, 31 men, 34 of those are going to be white, 3 of those are going to be persons of color, and 0 women of color in the Kentucky Senate. At a national level, the senators and House representatives, all of them are white males. So really just something to think about as we start hitting the voters box. And these are the slides that I was telling you about, where you're going to have 4 slides that really detail the first for everything. Honestly, just print them out, have them with you. There's something that as we talk about, or as you go through your academic career, there are people that you can look up. There are things that you can talk about. And they're also a good way to have and start conversations about representation. excuse me. Also, when you look at that first slide, especially, and you look at those women that prior to the right of vote were still rocking out some of the political mainstream and having and holding political power. Those are very key and interesting conversations. And then again, part 4 is going to be updated to even talk about our newest Supreme Court justice and our current vice president. So that will give you some information. You're welcome to it. I'm going to stop here and I'm going to get back in, and then I will finish this particular section, and then we'll get into the activism. Thank you so much. And I hope you guys are having a great week and have had a wonderful class. I enjoyed all of you.